Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Computer Scientist. Tonight, we're descending into one of the internet's most unsettling collaborative nightmares, a place that doesn't exist, yet feels more real than it should. A maze born from a single photograph that somehow captured the essence of a fear you didn't know you had. This is the story of the Backrooms. Before we begin our journey into the infinite yellow hallways, I invite you to like, subscribe, or share a thought in the comments below. It helps other curious minds find their way here, one sleepy soul at a time. But for now, settle in, let the night wrap around you, and prepare to explore the spaces between spaces. Imagine, if you will, a photograph, not of anything overtly horrifying. No blood, no monsters, no obvious threat. Just a room. Yellow wallpaper, slightly dingy. Fluorescent lights humming overhead, their panels yellowed with age. Industrial carpet, damp in places, showing the tracks of moisture seeping through. Empty. Utterly, completely empty. And somehow, this emptiness is more terrifying than any monster could ever be. This photograph appeared on the internet in 2019, and within months it had spawned an entire mythology. An infinite maze of empty rooms and corridors, a place you could fall into if you weren't careful, if you no-clipped out of reality in just the wrong place. The Backrooms, a name that perfectly captures the feeling of spaces that exist behind the world we know. Service corridors, maintenance areas, the parts of buildings we're not supposed to see. The image itself is unremarkable in many ways. It could be a basement, an old office, a storage area in a shopping mall from the 1980s. The resolution isn't particularly high. The angle is slightly off-kilter, as if taken quickly, without much thought. And yet, something about it reaches into your brain and activates a deep, primal unease. You've been here before, your mind insists. Not in this exact room, but somewhere like it. Somewhere you've forgotten. Somewhere you were never supposed to remember. The genius of this photograph is in its mundanity. It shows a space that is familiar enough to trigger recognition, but empty enough to trigger alarm. Every element is recognizable. Office carpet, commercial wallpaper, drop ceiling tiles, fluorescent lighting, yet the combination creates something deeply wrong. It's the architectural equivalent of the uncanny valley, close enough to reality to fool your pattern recognition systems, but far enough away to set off every alarm bell evolution installed in your nervous system. What makes it particularly unsettling is the sense of scale. The photograph suggests that this isn't just one room, but rather a glimpse into something larger. The hallways extend beyond the frame. There are corners that turn into more hallways, doorways that might lead to identical rooms. The space implies infinity, and infinity is something the human mind cannot comfortably process. We are creatures of boundaries, of defined spaces, of beginnings and endings. The suggestion that you could wander these yellow halls forever, that there might be no exit, no variation, no escape from the sameness, taps into something fundamental and terrible. The lighting adds another layer of psychological distress. Fluorescent lights are already associated with uncomfortable spaces, hospitals, government offices, waiting rooms, places where we feel powerless or anxious. But these lights are old, yellowed, casting everything in a sickly hue that suggests decay. Some panels appear dimmer than others, creating patches of shadow that your mind wants to fill with something lurking just out of sight. The lights hum, you can almost hear them through the photograph. That endless electrical buzz that becomes maddening after hours of exposure. And then there's the carpet. Damp, stained. The darker patches suggest water damage or something worse. Why is the carpet wet? Where is the water coming from? Is it spreading? The wetness implies that this space is not maintained, that it's been abandoned, left to slowly rot. Yet the lights are still on. Someone, or something, is still paying the electric bill. The space is derelict but not dead, which is somehow more disturbing than if it were completely abandoned. The photograph captures what we might call negative space horror. It's not what's in the image that frightens us, it's what isn't there. No people, no furniture, no signs of life or purpose, no exit signs, no windows, no indication of where you are or how to leave, just endless yellow monotony stretching into infinity. The horror is in the absence, in the nothing, in the implication that you could walk these halls forever and never find anything different, never find anyone else, never find your way home. This single image became a seed that grew into an entire universe of horror. Within weeks of its posting, people began to write stories about it, to create maps, to develop rules for survival, to imagine creatures that might inhabit these spaces. The photograph became a collaborative canvas, and thousands of internet users picked up brushes to paint nightmares into the empty yellow halls. What started as one anonymous post on an image board became one of the most significant pieces of internet folklore in the modern era. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. To understand how the Backrooms grew from a single creepy photograph into a cultural phenomenon, we need to go back to the beginning. Back to 4chan, that strange, anarchic corner of the internet where so much of our modern digital folklore is born. Back to May 2019, when someone posted an image and asked a simple question, and in doing so opened a door that thousands would walk through into the yellow halls beyond. The story of the Backrooms begins, as so many internet legends do, on 4chan, specifically on the LX board, dedicated to paranormal discussion, conspiracy theories, and general weirdness. On May 12, 2019, an anonymous user created a thread with a simple prompt: post disquieting images that just feel off. The goal was to share photographs that created a sense of unease without obvious horror elements. No gore, no jump scares, just images that made you feel uncomfortable in ways you couldn't quite articulate. This wasn't a new concept on X. The board has a long history of sharing and discussing unsettling images, particularly those depicting liminal spaces. The term liminal space had been gaining traction online, referring to transitional areas, hallways, waiting rooms, empty malls, places that exist primarily to get you from one location to another. These spaces are unsettling because they are designed to be temporary, to be passed through quickly, and seeing them empty and static creates a cognitive dissonance that many people find deeply uncomfortable. Into this thread, another anonymous user posted the photograph, the image of yellow wallpapered rooms and fluorescent lights. They didn't provide context, didn't claim to have taken it themselves, didn't offer any explanation, just the image. In the anarchic, ephemeral nature of 4chan, where threads disappear after a few hours and anonymity is default, this was unremarkable. Just another contribution to a thread about creepy pictures. But then something happened. Another user, still anonymous, posted a response that would change everything. They wrote a short piece of text that would become the foundational lore of the Backrooms. It read, "If you're not careful and you clip out of reality in the wrong areas, you'll end up in the Backrooms, where it's nothing but the stink of old moist carpet, the madness of mono yellow, the endless background noise of fluorescent lights at maximum hum buzz, and approximately 600 million square miles of randomly segmented empty rooms to be trapped in. God save you if you hear something wandering around nearby, because it sure as hell has heard you." This post was genius in its simplicity. It took the unsettling photograph and gave it context, mythology, rules. The term no-clip borrowed from video game glitches, where characters pass through solid geometry due to programming errors, perfectly captured the idea of accidentally falling through reality into somewhere you shouldn't be. The description of sensory details, the smell of old carpet, the oppressive yellow colour, the maddening hum of lights, transformed the visual image into a multi-sensory nightmare. The mention of 600 million square miles gave the space impossible, reality-breaking scale. That's larger than the surface area of Earth. The implication that you could be trapped there, wandering forever through identical rooms, spoke to deep-seated fears of being lost, of meaningless repetition, of existential imprisonment. And that final line, the warning about something wandering nearby, introduced the possibility of unseen threats. The backrooms weren't just empty, they were inhabited. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Other users began contributing their own thoughts, expanding the concept, adding details. What kind of creatures might live in the backrooms? Are there other levels? Can you escape? Are there supplies? What happens if you run? The thread exploded with creative energy, each anonymous poster adding another piece to a collaborative puzzle that was rapidly taking shape. This is how digital folklore is born in the modern age. Unlike traditional folklore, which develops slowly over generations through oral tradition, internet folklore can emerge in hours. The collaborative, anonymous nature of places like 4chan creates a perfect environment for myth-making. No single author owns the story. Everyone contributes. The mythology develops through collective effort, with ideas that resonate gaining traction, while those that don't fit the emerging aesthetic falling away. Within days, the concept had spread beyond 4chan. People began posting about the backrooms on Reddit, Twitter, Tumblr. Artists created illustrations depicting different areas of the backrooms. Writers crafted survival guides and exploration logs. The mythology grew more complex. Someone created a wiki to catalogue the emerging lore. The idea of multiple levels developed, with level 0 being the original yellow hallways, and descending or ascending levels offering different environments, each with their own dangers and characteristics. What made the Backrooms particularly effective as a collaborative horror project was its openness. The original post was vague enough to allow interpretation. There was no official canon, no author to say what was or wasn't part of the world. Anyone could contribute. This democratic approach to storytelling meant that the Backrooms could evolve rapidly, incorporating thousands of perspectives and fears. If someone wrote a compelling description of a new level or entity, and others found it frightening or interesting, it became part of the accepted lore through sheer popularity. The timing was also important. By 2019, the internet had become sufficiently nostalgic for the analog era. The aesthetic of the original image, very 1980s or 1990s in its colour palette and architectural style, resonated with millennials and older Gen Z users who remembered spaces like this from their childhoods. Old malls, schools, office buildings from before modern design aesthetics took over. There was something emotionally potent about taking these half-remembered spaces and transforming them into horror. It was nostalgia twisted into nightmare. The Backrooms also emerged during a period of increasing interest in analog horror and found footage horror. Projects like Local 58 and the Monument Mythos had shown that there was a huge audience for horror that felt like it had been discovered rather than created, like stumbled upon VHS tapes or forgotten documentation of something terrible. The Backrooms fit perfectly into this aesthetic. The low-resolution photograph looked like it had been captured on an old digital camera or phone. The mythology presented itself as documentation of a real phenomenon, with survivors writing escape guides and explorers mapping the levels. In many ways, the Backrooms represent the evolution of creepypasta culture. Early creepypastas like Slender Man or Jeff the Killer were largely individual creations that spread through reposting and retelling. But by the late 20s and 10s, collaborative world-building had become more sophisticated. Projects like the SCP Foundation had shown that a community could build intricate, internally consistent mythologies through wiki-style documentation. The Backrooms took this collaborative approach and applied it to a more impressionistic, less structured form of horror. Instead of clinical documentation, it offered dream logic and visceral sensation. But beneath the rapid spread and enthusiastic participation, there was something deeper happening. The Backrooms weren't just a scary story or a creative writing exercise. They were tapping into something real, a genuine anxiety about modern spaces, about isolation, about the possibility of becoming lost in systems too large to comprehend. The yellow hallways weren't just fictional nightmare fuel, they were a metaphor, a collective expression of fears that many people felt but couldn't quite articulate. To understand why the Backrooms resonated so deeply, why that single photograph could launch such an extensive mythology, we need to examine the psychology behind it. We need to talk about liminal spaces, about why certain environments feel deeply wrong even when they're perfectly safe. We need to explore what it is about empty, transitional areas that triggers such profound unease in the human mind. The term liminal comes from the Latin word limen, meaning threshold. In anthropology, liminal spaces are transitional zones between one state and another, a hallway between rooms, a waiting room before an appointment, an airport terminal between departure and arrival. These are places defined not by what they are, but by what they lead to. They have no inherent purpose beyond passage. They are the in-between. Psychologically, humans are deeply uncomfortable with in-between states. We like categories, boundaries, clear definitions. Something is either inside or outside, safe or dangerous, familiar or strange. Liminal spaces violate these clean categories. They're not quite public, not quite private, not quite indoors, not quite outdoors, not quite anywhere really. They exist in a conceptual grey zone that our pattern-seeking brains struggle to classify, and that struggle creates anxiety. When you're in a transitional space, your brain is in a state of mild alertness. You're passing through, so you're not quite relaxed, but you're not in danger. So you're not in fight or flight mode. You're in a kind of psychological holding pattern. This is fine when the space is populated and when your passage through it is brief. But when a liminal space is empty, when you're alone in it, or when your time there extends beyond what feels normal, something shifts. The mild alertness becomes unease. The question changes from where am I going to why am I still here? Empty liminal spaces are particularly disturbing because they violate our expectations. These spaces are designed for movement, for crowds, for activity. Seeing them empty feels wrong in the same way that silence in a normally noisy environment feels wrong. Your brain registers the absence of expected stimuli and interprets it as a potential threat. If everyone else has left, your hindbrain whispers, maybe there's a reason, maybe there's danger you haven't detected yet. Maybe you should leave too. The Backrooms photograph captures this psychological effect perfectly. It shows a space that clearly was designed for some purpose. The carpet, the lighting, the structure suggest a commercial or institutional building, but there's no indication of what that purpose was. More importantly, there's no one there. No people, no furniture, no personal effects, just infrastructure. Just the bones of a space stripped of function and meaning. This creates what psychologists call semantic satiation, where a thing becomes strange through removal of context. The space looks like it should mean something, but it doesn't, and that gap between expectation and reality creates profound discomfort. There's also a temporal dimension to the unease. Liminal spaces often feel unstuck in time. The aesthetic of the backrooms, the yellow wallpaper, the old fluorescent lights, the industrial carpet is distinctly dated. It looks like it could be from the 1980s or 1990s. This creates a strange temporal dislocation. Are you in the past? Is this place frozen in time? Has time stopped here? Or does time work differently in these halls? The temporally ambiguous nature of the space adds another layer of wrongness. You can't pin down when this is, which means you can't pin down what this is, and that uncertainty feeds anxiety. Neuroscientists studying responses to liminal space imagery have found interesting patterns. Brain regions associated with navigation and spatial orientation, particularly the hippocampus and parahippocampal gyrus, show increased activity. This makes sense. Your brain is trying to map the space, to understand where you are and how to navigate it. But in liminal spaces, especially in images or descriptions of the backrooms, there aren't enough distinct features to create a reliable mental map. The sameness, the repetition, the lack of landmarks all frustrate the brain's attempt to orient itself. Simultaneously, the amygdala, associated with fear and threat detection, shows activation. Not the strong activation you'd see in response to an obvious threat, but a low-level, persistent activation. Your threat detection system knows something is wrong, but it can't identify what. This combination, frustrated spatial navigation and low-level threat detection, creates a particular flavour of anxiety. You're lost, or you could become lost, and there might be danger, but you don't know what or where. It's the anxiety of uncertainty. Interestingly, people with certain anxiety disorders, particularly agoraphobia, show stronger negative responses to liminal space imagery. This suggests that these spaces tap into pre-existing anxieties about being trapped, being unable to escape, being in unfamiliar territory without help. For these individuals, the backrooms aren't just creepy, they're triggering. They activate real, clinical fears. The colour palette of the original Backrooms image also plays a psychological role. Yellow, particularly the dingy, sickly yellow of old wallpaper and fluorescent lights, is associated with illness, decay, and caution. Yellow is the colour of quarantine signs, of hazard warnings, of bile and jaundice. It's not a comforting colour in this context. Combined with the artificial lighting, which creates harsh shadows and eliminates the warmth of natural light, the yellow becomes oppressive. You're bathed in a colour that subconsciously signals sickness and danger. The texture of the space matters too. Carpet in commercial buildings is usually chosen for durability and ease of maintenance, not comfort. It's thin, industrial, utilitarian. The kind of carpet that feels cheap under your feet, that shows wear quickly, that absorbs stains and odours. The description in the original Backrooms post of the stink of old moist carpet evokes visceral disgust. Moisture and carpet should never go together. Damp carpet suggests mould, rot, neglect. It's a texture that belongs in abandoned buildings, in places where maintenance has ceased and decay has begun. The sound design described in the original post, the endless background noise of fluorescent lights at maximum hum buzz, is another brilliant psychological touch. Constant droning noise is a form of sensory torture. It prevents your mind from settling into rest or focus. The hum of fluorescent lights is particularly maddening because it's not quite loud enough to demand attention, but not quiet enough to ignore. It sits in the background, a perpetual reminder that you're in an artificial environment, that natural silence has been banished, that you can never quite escape the presence of the machinery. This combination of visual, tactile, olfactory and auditory elements creates what we might call a hostile sensory environment. Nothing is acutely painful or dangerous, but everything is subtly wrong. Over time, these subtle wrongnesses would accumulate into psychological distress. The space weaponizes mundanity. It turns the everyday elements of institutional architecture into instruments of mental erosion. But there's something else happening in our response to liminal spaces, and to the backrooms in particular. There's a sense of recognition. Many people, upon seeing the image or reading the description, report feeling like they've been there before, not literally in that specific room, but in spaces like it. Forgotten corners of schools, service corridors in malls, basements of office buildings, maintenance areas glimpsed briefly while taking a wrong turn. These are spaces that exist in the margins of our memory, places we pass through without really noticing, and seeing them presented as horror somehow feels right. It validates a discomfort we didn't know we had. This feeling of recognition is part of what makes the backrooms so effective as a psychological horror concept. It's not entirely alien. It's not a monster or a ghost or some impossible thing. It's places you've actually been, or places so similar to places you've been that your brain can't tell the difference. The horror comes from the realization that these uncomfortable spaces you barely noticed, that you passed through quickly and forgot about, could somehow become your entire world. That you could become trapped in the transitional, that the passage could become the destination. To truly understand the backrooms phenomenon, we need to dissect the original image and its accompanying lore with the precision of a pathologist examining a specimen. Level 0, as it came to be known, is the entry point, the default state, the place you arrive if you no-clip out of reality. It's the foundation upon which all other levels are built, and every element of it has been carefully analysed by the community that grew around the concept. Let's start with the wallpaper. It's not a complex pattern, just a simple, repeating design in varying shades of yellow and cream. The style suggests commercial wallpaper from the late 20th century, the kind you'd find in office buildings, hotels, or medical facilities from the 1980s or 1990s. This specific aesthetic choice is important. Modern commercial spaces tend toward minimalism, clean white walls, maybe some accent colours. But older buildings used patterned wallpaper like this to add visual interest without requiring maintenance. It was practical, durable, and cheap. The yellowing of the wallpaper, whether it was originally this colour or has aged into it, creates an impression of age and neglect. Nothing has been updated here. This space exists in a kind of temporal stasis, frozen in an outdated aesthetic. The pattern itself is regular but not quite perfectly aligned where panels meet, suggesting either rushed installation or gradual shifting of the walls over time. These small imperfections keep the space from feeling entirely artificial. It has just enough irregularity to seem real, which makes it more disturbing. The fluorescent lights are perhaps the most commented upon feature. They're the long, rectangular panels common in commercial ceiling grids, and they cast that particular flat, shadowless illumination that fluorescent bulbs produce. Several things make these lights unsettling. First, their constant presence. There are no dark areas in level 0, no shadows deep enough to hide in, no natural darkness. The lights are always on, creating perpetual artificial day. This disrupts the natural circadian rhythm and creates disorientation. Second, the quality of the light itself. Fluorescent bulbs produce light through electrical discharge in mercury vapor. creating a spectrum that's different from sunlight or incandescent bulbs. The light often has a greenish or bluish tint that makes colours look slightly off, and human skin look sickly. In the case of level 0, the bulbs appear aged, adding a yellow cast that combines with the yellow walls to create an oppressive monochrome environment. Everything is shades of yellow, from pale cream to deep mustard, creating colour fatigue and visual monotony. Third, the sound. While you can't hear it in a photograph, the description insists on the endless background noise of fluorescent lights at maximum hum buzz. This is based on real experience. Older fluorescent fixtures do hum and buzz, the sound of the ballast and the electrical discharge. It's typically around 60 Hz in North America or 50 Hz in Europe, a frequency that falls right in the range most annoying to human hearing. Over time, this constant droning becomes psychological torture, impossible to ignore but also impossible to escape. Fourth, the failures. Look closely at the image, and you might notice that not all panels are equally bright. Some appear dimmer, suggesting failing bulbs or ballasts. This creates uneven lighting, patches that are slightly darker, areas where the shadows aren't quite banished. These imperfections introduce uncertainty. What's in the darker areas? How long until more lights fail? Will you eventually be trapped here in darkness? The ceiling itself is a standard drop ceiling or suspended ceiling, composed of removable tiles set in a metal grid. This is utilitarian architecture at its most basic. Drop ceilings are used because they're cheap, they provide access to wiring and ductwork, and they absorb sound. But they're also associated with institutional spaces, offices, schools, hospitals, places where you don't have control or comfort. The ceiling in level 0 appears intact, but the presence of a drop ceiling suggests there is space above it, hidden infrastructure, pipes and wires, and darkness. Another layer of the backrooms that you can't see but know is there. Now let's talk about the carpet. The description emphasizes old, moist carpet, and even in the still image you can see darker patches suggesting moisture. This is perhaps the most viscerally disturbing element. Carpet should be dry. Moisture means something has gone wrong, there's a leak, there's flooding, there's water coming from somewhere it shouldn't be. And in an enclosed space with poor ventilation, moisture in carpet breeds mold. The smell would be musty, organic, slightly sweet and sickly. The texture would be wrong too, spongy in wet areas, the pile matted down, making unpleasant squelching sounds as you walk. The pattern of the carpet is industrial, simple, designed to hide stains and wear. It's a beige or tan colour, neutral and forgettable. But the moisture creates variation. Dark patches that might be water, might be older stains, might be something else. Your eyes try to find patterns in these irregularities, try to make sense of them, but they're random enough to frustrate pattern recognition. It's visual noise that your brain can't quite filter out. The layout of level 0 is a maze. The photograph shows multiple doorways and corridors extending in different directions. There's no clear sense of organization or logic to the architecture. Hallways branch off at odd angles. Rooms appear to have multiple entrances. There are no signs, no labels, no indicators of purpose or direction. Navigation becomes impossible. Every hallway looks like every other hallway, every room like every other room. Without distinct landmarks, your mental map fails. You can't remember which turns you've taken or which rooms you've already seen. This is intentional, of course. The Backrooms mythology emphasizes the impossibility of escape specifically because navigation is impossible. Even if you could walk fast enough to cover the 600 million square miles mentioned in the original post, you couldn't map it, couldn't mark your progress, couldn't know if you were moving toward anything or just walking in enormous circles. The space defeats you through its sameness. The absence of any objects is another key element. No furniture, no decorations, no trash, no personal effects. Nothing that would indicate this space was ever used for anything. It's architecture without purpose, form without function. This absence creates questions that can't be answered. What is this place? Why does it exist? Who built it? Why are the lights still on? The lack of any clues makes the space feel less real, more dreamlike, as if it exists in some liminal state between reality and unreality. But there's one more element we need to discuss. The element that transforms Level 0 from merely unsettling to actively horrifying. The suggestion of presence. The final line of the original post. God save you if you hear something wandering around nearby, because it sure as hell has heard you. This single sentence introduces the possibility of entities, of things that inhabit the backrooms, of threats beyond the environmental. The genius of this line is its vagueness. It doesn't describe what might be wandering around. It doesn't give the threat a form. It just suggests that something is there and that it has heard you. This is primal fear. The fear of being hunted, of being prey. The empty hallways suddenly become hunting grounds. The silence becomes threatening. Any sound you make, your footsteps on the wet carpet, your breathing, becomes a beacon that might draw something to you. This transforms the entire experience of Level 0. It's no longer just an empty maze. It's an empty maze where you're not alone, where something might be around any corner, where the sound of footsteps that aren't yours might echo down a hallway, where you might glimpse movement in your peripheral vision and turn to find nothing there. The absence of visible threats becomes more frightening than any monster, because your imagination fills the void with every fear you've ever had. The environmental horror and the entity horror work together synergistically. The environment wears you down, exhausts you, disorients you. The entities provide immediate, acute danger. You're dealing with chronic existential dread and acute physical threat simultaneously. Your mind never gets to rest. You're constantly stressed by the environment and constantly alert for threats. It's a psychological and physiological perfect storm. In analysing Level 0, what we find is a masterclass in understated horror. Nothing is overtly monstrous. Everything is just wrong enough to trigger discomfort without crossing into obvious scariness. It's the horror of the mundane taken to an extreme, of normal spaces becoming abnormal through context, of safety becoming threat through isolation and endlessness. Level 0 works because it could be real, because spaces like this do exist, because your brain recognizes them and recoils from them simultaneously. This is why the photograph works so well as a seed for collaborative horror. It provided just enough detail to be concrete, to be visualizable, but left enough ambiguous to allow interpretation and expansion. The image and its accompanying text created a framework that thousands of people could build upon, and build they did, creating one of the most extensive collaborative horror mythologies in internet history. Within weeks of the original post, the Backrooms had exploded beyond 4chan into a sprawling multi-platform phenomenon. The concept migrated to Reddit, where the subreddit r Backrooms was created and quickly gained thousands of members. On the Backrooms wiki, contributors began documenting different levels, entities, objects, and survival strategies with the kind of detailed thoroughness usually reserved for established fictional universes like Star Trek or Lord of the Rings. What happened next was a fascinating example of collaborative world-building at internet speed. The original post had established Level 0 and hinted at the existence of other levels, but hadn't specified what they were or how many existed. The community took this ambiguity and ran with it, creating a numerical system of levels that could theoretically extend infinitely. Some levels were numbered positively, Level 1, Level 2, etc., suggesting descent or progression deeper into the backrooms. Others were numbered negatively, Level 1, Level 2, suggesting ascent or reverse progression. Some levels weren't even numbered. They were given names or classifications that set them apart from the main sequence. Each level had its own distinct characteristics, aesthetic, dangers, and rules. This variety was crucial to keeping the concept fresh. If every level had been yellow hallways, the horror would have become monotonous. But by allowing each level to be completely different, the mythology maintained interest and allowed contributors to explore different types of environmental horror. Level 1 was described as a massive concrete industrial complex, an endless parking garage or maintenance space with bare concrete walls, exposed piping, and the distant hum of machinery. Level 2 was described as a maze of utility tunnels with pipes that leaked scalding steam and the ever-present sound of rushing water. Level 3, called the electrical station, was characterized by long corridors lined with electrical equipment, generators, and server rooms, all humming with barely contained power that could electrocute an unwary wanderer. The expansion didn't stop at levels. The community began populating the backrooms with entities, creatures that supposedly inhabited the various levels. These ranged from the vaguely humanoid to the completely alien. Smilers were described as entities visible only by their glowing eyes and teeth floating in the darkness, creatures that would follow you silently until you panicked and ran, at which point they would chase. Skin stealers were said to be entities that could perfectly mimic human appearance, leading travelers into traps. Hounds were described as dog-like creatures that hunted in packs through the levels. Each entity had its own behavior patterns, weaknesses, and danger levels. The wiki developed a classification system from Class 0, safe, non-hostile, to Class 5, extremely dangerous, near certain death if encountered. This systematic approach transformed the backrooms from a single creepy concept into something resembling a survival horror video game, complete with enemy types, danger zones, and strategic considerations. The community also created objects, special items that could be found in the backrooms and had unique properties. Almond water became a legendary substance, a liquid found in bottles throughout the levels that supposedly kept you hydrated and sane, preventing the psychological degradation that would otherwise occur from prolonged exposure to the backrooms. Liquid pain was described as a dangerous substance that caused extreme agony if touched. Superglue could supposedly seal exits and entrances between levels. These objects added another layer of gameplay-like mechanics to the mythology. Groups and communities within the backrooms were also imagined. The MeG, Major Explorer Group, was described as an organization of trapped individuals who had banded together to explore, map, and survive the backrooms. They supposedly maintained bases on safer levels and conducted expeditions into more dangerous areas. The Lost were described as individuals who had been in the backrooms so long they'd gone insane, becoming hostile to other survivors. These factions added a social dimension to what had started as a solitary horror concept. The writing style that emerged on the Backrooms wiki was deliberately clinical and documentary, mimicking the tone of the SCP Foundation. Entries were written as if they were factual reports from researchers or explorers. They included survival tips, danger assessments, and detailed descriptions of environments and entities. This faux documentary style added verisimilitude, making the fiction feel more like discovered truth than invented story. But as the mythology expanded, tensions emerged within the community. Some purists felt that the proliferation of levels and entities was diluting the horror of the original concept. The power of Level 0, they argued, came from its simplicity and its implied infinity. By creating dozens or hundreds of distinct levels, each with its own gimmick, the community was transforming the Backrooms from a place of existential dread into something more like a theme park of horror. A collection of scary set pieces rather than a coherent nightmare. Others felt that the addition of entities was a mistake. The original horror of the Backrooms came from emptiness, from the absence of life, from being utterly alone in an infinite space. Introducing monsters, they argued, made it just another creature feature horror story. The fear of being alone in the yellow hallways was more profound than the fear of being chased by a monster. The former was existential. The latter was conventional. There were also debates about tone. Some contributors wanted to maintain a sense of oppressive bleakness, where escape was impossible and death or madness were the only outcomes. Others wanted to introduce hope, safe levels where communities could form, ways to potentially escape, a sense that survival was difficult but possible. These different visions created a mythology that was sometimes internally contradictory, with different wiki pages presenting different versions of the same concepts. Despite these tensions, or perhaps because of them, the Backrooms continued to grow. The flexibility of the concept, the fact that there was no single author or canonical version, meant that it could accommodate multiple visions simultaneously. If you wanted the bleak, empty horror of the original, Level 0 was still there. If you wanted survival horror with monsters and resources, other levels provided that. If you wanted cosmic horror, some levels described reality-breaking phenomena and impossible geometries. The Backrooms became a framework that could support almost any type of horror story. Artists contributed illustrations and 3D renders of different levels, bringing the descriptions to life visually. Photographers began sharing real-world images of liminal spaces, tagging them as Backrooms core or potential entrances. The aesthetic spread beyond the specific mythology, becoming a broader category of unsettling imagery. Liminal space photography became its own genre, with accounts on Instagram and Twitter dedicated to sharing images of empty malls, deserted hotels, vacant office buildings, all carrying that same uncanny quality as the original Backrooms photo. Musicians created ambient soundscapes meant to represent the audio environment of different levels, long tracks of humming fluorescent lights, distant machinery, echoing footsteps, and unsettling drones. These pieces were designed for sleep or meditation, ironically, using the unsettling atmosphere of the Backrooms as a backdrop for relaxation, perhaps because the predictability of the discomfort was less stressful than the unpredictability of silence. Video creators on YouTube began making found footage-style exploration videos, using video game engines to create walkthrough simulations of various levels. These videos were presented as if they were actual recordings from cameras that had been found in the Backrooms, documentation of someone's exploration before they disappeared or died. The low-quality, glitchy aesthetics of these videos added to their verisimilitude, making them feel like genuine artifacts rather than created content. But while all this creative expansion was happening, a parallel effort was underway. Some members of the community weren't content with expanding the mythology. They wanted to find the truth. They wanted to know where that original photograph actually came from. Who took it? When? Where? Was it really just a random basement or storage room, or was there more to the story? Thus began one of internet history's most dedicated pieces of collaborative detective work. For internet detectives and researchers, finding the source of the original Backrooms image became a kind of holy grail. The photograph had appeared anonymously on 4chan, which meant there was no easy way to trace it back to its origins. No XCF data had been preserved. 4chan strips metadata from uploaded images. No reverse image search turned up earlier instances. It seemed to have appeared fully formed, without history or context, which only added to its mystique. The search effort was organised primarily on Reddit and Discord, where dedicated users began systematically trying to identify the location in the photograph. They started with the architectural elements. The wallpaper pattern was analysed in detail. Could they identify the manufacturer? When was this style popular? What regions of the world used this type of wallpaper? The carpet was similarly examined. The fluorescent light fixtures, the drop ceiling tiles. Each element was a potential clue. The investigation involved reaching out to manufacturers of commercial building materials, posting in architecture forums, consulting with people who had worked in construction or building maintenance during the 1980s and 1990s. Every lead was followed, no matter how tenuous. Someone would recognise a similar wallpaper pattern from a hotel they'd stayed in as a child. Another person would remember carpet like that from their elementary school. Each anecdote was catalogued and analysed for patterns. Geographical analysis was attempted. The style of the space suggested North American construction, possibly Midwest or Pacific Northwest, based on the building codes and materials that were common in those regions during the apparent time period. But this was speculation based on fuzzy memories and incomplete information. The space could theoretically be anywhere in the world where American-style commercial construction was used. One breakthrough came when researchers focused on the specific configuration of the space. The way the hallways intersected, the placement of the doorways, the overall layout. This wasn't just any generic commercial space. It had a specific geometry. If they could identify the type of building that used this particular layout, they could narrow the search. The configuration suggested retail space, possibly a former store that had been gutted or renovated. Months passed. The investigation seemed to hit dead ends repeatedly. The anonymous nature of the original post meant there was no way to contact the person who had shared the image and simply ask them. Even if someone claimed to be that person, there would be no way to verify it. The mystery seemed unsolvable, destined to remain part of the enigma of the Backrooms. But then, in May 2024, nearly 5 years after the original post, a breakthrough occurred. The discovery emerged from a combined effort in a Backrooms-dedicated Discord community, which traced the image to an archived web page from March 2003 using the Wayback Machine. The location was revealed through careful investigation. A former furniture store in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, specifically a HobbyTown USA location that had been photographed during renovation in 2002. The revelation was simultaneously exciting and deflating. Exciting because the mystery had been solved, because the location was real and could be verified. Deflating because the mundane truth was so much less interesting than the mythology. Not a mysterious portal to another dimension, not a haunted basement, not some architectural anomaly that defied explanation. Just a hobby store in Wisconsin, photographed during a renovation when the space was temporarily empty. Further investigation confirmed the finding. The building had housed Rona's home furnishings for much of the 20th century before it closed in 1994. In 2002, HobbyTown acquired the space and began renovations of the second floor. On June 12, 2002, the progress was photographed with the Sony CyberShot camera, and on March 3, 2003, various interior views were documented on the Oshkosh branch's renovation blog. The image file was originally captioned as a view of the East Oval Room and noted extensive water damage that required the area to be cleared. Local residents of Oshkosh confirmed that the space looked familiar. Even the moisture stains on the carpet could be explained by the renovation process and the documented water damage mentioned in the original blog post. But this raised another question. Who had taken the photograph? The image had been circulating on various message boards and image sharing sites since at least 2011, long before the 2019 4chan post that launched the Backrooms phenomenon. Was it someone from the renovation crew, an employee documenting the progress, a photographer hired by HobbyTown? And crucially, had they intended to create an unsettling image? Or had they simply documented an unusual space during a mundane renovation project? This question proved harder to answer. The original photographer's identity remained unknown even after the location was discovered. The image had clearly been taken as documentation of the renovation work and posted to the HobbyTown blog in 2003. But it had somehow migrated from that innocent context into the darker corners of the internet, where it was eventually posted to 4chan in 2019. The photographer, if they were aware of what their mundane documentation had spawned, chose to remain silent. This silence was perhaps appropriate. The power of the Backrooms had always come from its anonymity, from the sense that it was found rather than created. Knowing that the photographer was some specific person with specific intentions would have reduced the mystique. It was better, in a way, that they remained unknown. The photograph could continue to feel like an artifact, something discovered rather than produced. The identification of the actual location didn't kill the Backrooms phenomenon. If anything, it added another layer to the mythology. Now there was a real place you could theoretically visit, though HobbyTown has since converted the facility into a radio-controlled car racing track called Revolution Racing, and the room's original layout is now gone. The fact that it was in Wisconsin, of all places, added a kind of cosmic irony. Not some exotic location, but the American Midwest, the realm of the ordinary, which was fitting for a horror concept based on mundane spaces. Some fans made pilgrimages to Oshkosh, photographing the building, which by then had been fully renovated and no longer looked like the original image. These pilgrimages were half serious, half ironic, acknowledging the absurdity of treating a hobby store as a sacred site, while simultaneously feeling the pull of the mythology. Standing in the actual space where the photograph was taken, you were standing at the border between fiction and reality, and that border was interesting in its own right. The investigation also revealed something important about internet culture and collaborative mythology. The community had been able to solve what seemed like an unsolvable mystery through sheer persistence and collective effort. Hundreds of people contributing small pieces of information, following up on leads, cross-referencing details, had accomplished what no individual could have done alone. It was citizen journalism applied to internet folklore, and it demonstrated the power of distributed research. But it also highlighted the difference between the myth and the reality. The myth was infinite, terrifying, full of possibility. The reality was a hobby store in Wisconsin. This gap between fiction and fact is where the Backrooms lived, where all internet folklore lives. The stories we tell are always more interesting than the truth, but the truth anchors the stories, gives them weight, makes them feel real enough to be scary. While the hunt for the physical location of the photograph succeeded in 2024, The identity of the original photographer remains a mystery. The image clearly came from HobbyTown's renovation documentation in 2002-2003, posted to their blog to show progress on converting the space. But who actually took the photograph, and how did it migrate from an innocent renovation blog to the depths of 4chan? What we know is this. The photograph was taken with the Sony Cybershot camera on June 12, 2002, during renovations of the second floor of the former Rona's Home Furnishings building. It was posted to HobbyTown's renovation blog on March 10, 2003, along with other documentation of the work. The caption noted it was the East Oval Room and mentioned the extensive water damage visible in the space. Somehow, between 2003 and 2011, this image escaped its original context and began circulating on various message boards and image-sharing sites. By the time it appeared on 4chan in May 2019, it had been divorced from any identifying information. No metadata, no context, no connection to its origin. Just an unsettling photograph of an empty room that felt deeply wrong. This revelation was fascinating for several reasons. First, it confirmed that the image had not been created with the intention of spawning a horror mythology. It was documentary, not art. A worker photographing an interesting space, nothing more. The horror had been projected onto it by others, by the anonymous 4chan user who had written the original descriptive text, and by the thousands who had built upon that foundation. Second, it demonstrated the distance between creator and creation in internet culture. The photographer had made the image, but had no ownership over what it became. They couldn't claim authorship of the Backrooms because the Backrooms weren't theirs. The image was just raw material that others had transformed into something else entirely. This is a common pattern in internet folklore. The original creator is often irrelevant or unknown, and the mythology develops independently of any single author's intentions. Third, it raised interesting questions about artistic intent and interpretation. Is the photographer an artist? They took a compelling photograph, one that clearly had aesthetic qualities that resonated with viewers, but they didn't intend it as art. They were documenting a space for practical purposes. Does the lack of artistic intent diminish the value of the image? Or does the response it generated validate it as art regardless of intent? These are old questions in aesthetics, but the internet age has made them newly relevant. The photographer's response to the Backrooms phenomenon was reportedly positive, if somewhat bemused. They expressed appreciation for the creativity of the community, enjoyed reading the various stories and seeing the artwork their image had inspired, and felt no sense of ownership or control over the mythology. They seemed to understand that the image had taken on a life of its own, that it belonged to the internet now, and that trying to assert authority over it would be both futile and contrary to the collaborative spirit that had made it special. The discovery in 2024 that the image came from a HobbyTown renovation didn't significantly change the Backrooms community or mythology. The stories continued to be written, the wiki continued to expand, the artwork continued to be produced. If anything, having the mundane origin story confirmed strengthened the mythology by grounding it in reality. Yes, it was fiction, but it was fiction built on a real foundation, a real photograph of a real place. That connection to reality made the fiction more tangible, more believable, more effective as horror. Some fans made pilgrimages to Oshkosh, visiting the building to see where the photograph was taken. These pilgrimages were half serious, half ironic, acknowledging the absurdity of treating a hobby store as a sacred site, while simultaneously feeling the pull of the mythology. Standing at the actual location where the photograph was taken meant standing at the border between fiction and reality, and that border held fascination in its own right. the investigation also revealed something important about internet culture and collaborative mythology. The community had been able to solve what seemed like an unsolvable mystery through sheer persistence and collective effort. It demonstrated the power of distributed research, showing that what no individual could accomplish alone, many working together could achieve. But it also highlighted the gap between myth and reality. The myth was infinite, terrifying, full of possibility and dread. The reality was a hobby store renovation in Wisconsin, documented in 2002, forgotten on an old blog, rediscovered and transformed into nightmare fuel. This gap is where the backrooms live, where all internet folklore lives. The stories we tell are always more interesting than the truth, but the truth anchors the stories, gives them weight, makes them feel real enough to be genuinely frightening. With the origin story now known, the Backrooms mythology could have collapsed. Instead, it continued to grow, because the power of the Backrooms was never really about that original photograph. It was about what that photograph represented, what it made people feel, what it helped them articulate. The mythology had taken on a life of its own, independent of its source material, and that mythology was far from finished expanding. To understand the full scope of the Backrooms mythology, we need to tour some of the most notable and well-developed levels. Each level represents a different flavour of environmental horror, a different architectural nightmare, a different way of being trapped. While Level 0 will always be the iconic original, the other levels show the creativity and diversity of the community that built this world. Level 1, often called the parking garage or habitable zone, was envisioned as a massive concrete industrial complex. Imagine an endless parking structure or warehouse with bare concrete walls, floors and ceilings. Exposed pipes run along the ceiling, some dripping water, others hissing steam. The lighting is minimal, bare bulbs hanging at irregular intervals, creating pools of dim light separated by stretches of darkness. The sound is the echo of water dripping, the hum of distant machinery, and your own footsteps reverberating off hard surfaces. Level 1 is considered more survivable than Level 0 for several reasons. First, there are resources. Water can be collected from dripping pipes, though its safety is questionable. Some areas have pallets of supplies that previous explorers have cached. Second, there are communities. The MEG supposedly maintains bases on Level 1, offering shelter and information to new arrivals. Third, the level has some navigational landmarks. The concrete pillars are numbered in some areas, providing a limited map. But survival is still difficult. The level is vast, resources are scarce, and entities do patrol the darker areas. Level 2, Pipe Dreams, was described as an endless maze of utility tunnels. The walls are lined with pipes of various sizes, from small conduits to massive main lines. Some pipes are hot to the touch, carrying steam or boiling water. Others are cold, containing coolant or waste. The sound is deafening in places, the rush of water through pipes, the hiss of steam, the clank of thermal expansion. The air is humid and stifling, making breathing difficult. Navigation is nearly impossible, as every tunnel looks like every other tunnel, and the pipes create visual obstruction that makes it hard to see far ahead. The danger of Level 2 comes primarily from the environment. Steam leaks can cause severe burns, pipes can burst, flooding tunnels with scalding water, oxygen levels can drop in poorly ventilated areas, the heat and humidity cause rapid dehydration. Entities are less common here, deterred by the harsh conditions, but that's small comfort when the environment itself is trying to kill you. Survival guides suggest moving quickly through Level 2, finding an exit to another level as soon as possible, as prolonged exposure is nearly always fatal. Level 3, the electrical station, was imagined as a vast complex of server rooms, generator halls, and electrical substations. The hum of electricity is constant, so pervasive it can be felt in your teeth and bones. Banks of servers line the walls, their LEDs blinking in patterns that might be communication or might be random. Generators the size of buildings rumble in massive halls, their diesel engines never stopping. Electrical panels and transformers sit behind chain link cages, humming with barely contained power. The air smells like ozone and hot metal. The lighting is harsh and fluorescent in some areas, non-existent in others. The primary danger of Level 3 is electrocution. Many surfaces are live with current. Water on the floors can conduct electricity from unknown sources. Touch the wrong panel or cross the wrong area, and you'll be killed instantly. There are also entities here, drawn to the electrical field, creatures that seem to be made of or powered by electricity itself. But there are advantages too. The electrical power means there are lights, which provide psychological comfort. Some areas have functioning computers or terminals with information about the backrooms. The MEG maintains a major base here, taking advantage of the power for lighting, communication equipment, and defensive systems. Level 4, the office, returns to familiar territory, an endless office complex stuck in the 1990s. Cubicles as far as the eye can see, each identical to the last. Beige walls, grey carpet, fluorescent lights, abandoned desks with old computers, ancient CRT monitors showing screensavers or frozen screens. The phones still work, but calling any number just connects you to other phones in Level 4. Ringing endlessly in empty cubicles. The copy machines are warm, as if someone just used them. Coffee cups sit on desks still full, as if someone just stepped away and will return any moment, but no one ever does. Level 4's horror is psychological. It's the existential dread of meaningless office work made literal. You're trapped in the ultimate corporate nightmare, an office that never ends, where there's no actual work to do but you can never leave. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead. The phones ring occasionally, startling you. You swear you hear keyboard typing or conversations in the distance, but when you investigate, there's nothing. Just more empty cubicles, more abandoned desks, more evidence of recent human presence without any actual humans. The isolation is maddening, as is the repetitive visual environment. Level 5, the hotel, presents as an abandoned hotel complex, sprawling and ornate but decaying. Grand lobbies with tarnished chandeliers, long hallways lined with room doors, most locked, some open to reveal ransacked rooms, ballrooms with faded elegant wallpaper, and banquet halls set for events that never happened. The carpet is thick but stained, the wallpaper peeling, the furniture dusty and moth-eaten. Everything has the appearance of former grandeur slowly rotting away. The lights work, mostly, but some flicker or have burned out, creating patches of darkness. The danger here is less environmental and more entity-driven. Level 5 is heavily populated by various entities, many of which are hostile. The complex layout provides many places for things to hide. The darkness creates opportunities for ambush. But there are also resources. Rooms sometimes contain supplies, and the ballrooms and banquet halls might have old, preserved food, though consuming it is risky. Some explorers report hearing piano music echoing through the halls, but the source is never found. Others report checking into rooms and falling asleep, only to wake up in different levels entirely, suggesting Level 5 might have unstable connections to other parts of the backrooms. Beyond these numbered levels, the mythology includes hundreds more. each with its own characteristics. Level 6 is said to be a vast construction site, frozen mid-build with exposed rebar, incomplete structures, and construction equipment sitting idle as if the workers just vanished. Level 7, called the Ocean, is described as an infinite sea under a fixed twilight sky, with scattered islands offering temporary refuge. Level 11, the City, presents as an abandoned urban environment, complete with empty streets, dark buildings and rusted vehicles, all covered in a perpetual grey fog. Some levels aren't numbered sequentially, but are given special designations. The pool rooms, also known as Level 37, became one of the most iconic secondary levels. This level consists of an endless complex of swimming pools, hot tubs, saunas, and locker rooms. The pools are filled with clean, clear water of various depths, from shallow wading pools to pools so deep their bottoms fade into darkness. The tiling is white and blue, clean and clinical. The lighting is consistent but somehow still unsettling, reflecting off the water and creating rippling patterns on the walls and ceilings. The pool rooms became iconic because they were visually distinct from Level 0 while maintaining that same liminal space quality. The images created to represent the pool rooms showed vast, empty natatoriums, the kind you might find in hotels or recreation centres but extended infinitely. The water is inviting but potentially dangerous. You don't know how deep it is, what might be in it, or if it's safe to drink. The sound is the echo of water lapping against tiles, the distant drip of a leak, the reverberating acoustics of large enclosed water spaces. It's both calming and intensely lonely. The Manila Rooms, another iconic secondary level, were described as an endless complex of rooms with manila-coloured walls, dim warm lighting, and a maze-like structure of small chambers and narrow hallways. The aesthetic is warmer than Level 0, less oppressive, but the labyrinthine nature is even more intense. You can easily become lost in the identical rooms, each one indistinguishable from the last. The level supposedly has relatively few entities, but is psychologically difficult due to the extreme disorientation and the warm, dim lighting that makes it hard to stay alert. Each level serves a different purpose in the mythology. Some are environmental hazards meant to kill you slowly through exposure or accident. Some are populated with dangerous entities that hunt you actively. Some are relatively safe havens where communities can form. Some are psychologically torturous through isolation or sensory manipulation. Together, they create a vast spectrum of horror experiences, ensuring that the Backrooms can accommodate almost any type of fear or anxiety. The level system also creates a sense of progression and exploration. You're not stuck in one environment forever, unless you want to write a story about that. You can move between levels, finding entrances and exits, discovering new dangers and new possibilities. This mobility keeps stories dynamic and gives writers freedom to explore different settings within a unified mythology. It transforms the Backrooms from a single, nightmarish space into an entire, nightmarish dimension with internal geography and structure. But the levels also raise interesting questions about the nature of the Backrooms. Who built all these spaces? Why do they exist? How do they connect to each other and to our reality? The mythology doesn't provide definitive answers, which is perhaps wise. Too much explanation would diminish the mystery. Too much structure would limit creative possibilities. The Backrooms work best when they remain inexplicable. When the why is less important than the what and the how. Empty spaces are frightening, but spaces that aren't quite empty are more frightening still. The original Backrooms post hinted at entities, things that wander the halls, Things that have heard you. The community took this hint and populated the Backrooms with a menagerie of creatures that range from merely unsettling to absolutely terrifying. These entities transformed the Backrooms from purely environmental horror into something more dynamic, introducing active threats that could hunt, stalk, and kill. These Smilers became one of the most iconic entities. They're described as beings visible only by their glowing eyes and teeth, floating disembodied in the darkness. You see a smile in the shadows, teeth too white, eyes too bright, and when you look away, when you try not to acknowledge what you've seen, you hear breathing, feel presence, know you're being watched. Smilers supposedly follow victims silently, getting closer whenever the victim isn't looking directly at them. They feed on fear, drawing out the terror as long as possible before attacking. Looking at them keeps them at bay, but you can't look forever. Eventually you blink, you turn away, you lose sight of them in the darkness, and then they close in. The psychological horror of Smilers is in the surveillance, in being watched from the darkness. They exploit the Weeping Angel's effect from Doctor Who, where the threat exists only when you're not looking. This creates a ratcheting tension where every moment of inattention could be fatal. In the endless darkness of many Backrooms levels, where your flashlight or phone battery will eventually die, Smilers represent inevitable doom. You can't watch forever. Eventually, the darkness wins. Skin stealers, or facelings, present a different type of horror, infiltration, and mimicry. These entities supposedly can appear almost human, wearing stolen skin and faces of previous victims. They might approach you looking like another survivor, offering help or asking for assistance. But something is off. Their movements are slightly wrong, too fluid or too jerky. Their eyes don't blink normally. Their smile doesn't quite reach their eyes. They speak in voices that don't match their faces, and if you trust them, if you follow them, they lead you into traps where more of them wait. The fear here is the fear of betrayal and the impossibility of trust. In an environment as hostile as the Backrooms, finding another human should be a relief. But if that human might be a monster wearing a stolen face, then contact with others becomes another source of danger rather than comfort. This plays on the deep social anxiety of not knowing who to trust, of being deceived by appearances, of the monster wearing a familiar face. In some versions of the lore, skin stealers are former humans who have been transformed, adding tragedy to the horror. Hounds are described as dog-like entities that hunt in packs. They're blind but have acute hearing, able to track prey by sound through complex environments. They communicate with each other through howls and barks that echo terrifyingly through empty halls. Fast, aggressive, and relentless, hounds represent the fear of being prey, of being chased by something that's faster and stronger than you. The only defense is silence and stillness, but maintaining that indefinitely is impossible. Eventually you'll make noise, your stomach will growl, you'll knock something over, you'll cough, and they'll hear you and come running. Partygoers inhabit a specific level called Level Fun, one of the most disturbing concepts in the Backrooms mythology. These entities appear as people in colourful party attire, speaking in cheerful voices and inviting you to join their fun. But their idea of fun is horrific. They forcibly transform humans into more partygoers through an infection process, essentially killing the person and wearing them as a costume. They're constantly cheerful, constantly inviting, but there's something profoundly wrong in their enthusiasm. They represent the horror of forced conformity, of having your identity stripped away and replaced with manufactured happiness. Death moths are described as large moth-like creatures attracted to light. In levels where light sources are rare and precious, having death moths drawn to your flashlight or lantern creates a terrible dilemma. You need light to navigate and to ward off other threats, but the light attracts these entities. They're said to drain body heat on contact, causing rapid hypothermia. Their wings beat with a sound like whispered voices, creating auditory hallucinations that can lead victims to panic or make poor decisions. They represent the double-edged nature of safety measures, where the thing you need to survive also draws danger to you. Windows are one of the more abstract entities. They're described as portals or openings that appear in walls, showing visions of other places, sometimes from the victim's memories, sometimes of other levels, sometimes of impossible or paradoxical spaces. Looking through them too long can cause vertigo, nausea, or psychological distress. Some windows show your actual home, your family, safety and comfort just on the other side of a barrier you can't cross. The cruelty of this is profound, seeing escape but being unable to reach it. Some stories suggest windows can be entered but usually lead to even more dangerous levels rather than to safety. Jerry is an interesting case, one of the few supposedly benign entities. Described as a deformed or abstract humanoid figure made of balloons or balloon-like material, Jerry supposedly helps lost travelers by pointing them towards safer areas or warning them of dangers. The community debates whether Jerry is genuinely helpful or has more sinister motives. The idea of a helpful entity in the Backrooms is almost more disturbing than straightforward hostility because it raises questions about motivation. Why would anything help you here? What does it gain? Can it be trusted, or is this just a more sophisticated trap? The entity classification system developed by the community adds game-like structure. Class 0 entities are non-hostile, might ignore humans entirely or even be beneficial. Class 1 entities are passive but might become dangerous if provoked. Class 2 entities are territorial, dangerous in specific areas but avoidable. Class 3 entities are actively hostile but escapable. Class 4 entities are highly dangerous pursuit predators. Class 5 entities are nearly impossible to survive encountering. This system gives writers and readers a quick reference for threat assessment and helps maintain some consistency across different stories. But the proliferation of entities also created some problems for the mythology. With dozens or hundreds of different creatures documented on the wiki, the Backrooms began to feel crowded rather than empty. The original horror of vast emptiness got diluted by having a monster around every corner. Some contributors pushed back against this, advocating for stories that emphasized isolation over confrontation, where the horror came from days or weeks of encountering nothing rather than from constant threats. This tension reflects a fundamental difference in what makes horror effective. Some people find empty spaces most frightening, the fear of being alone, of sensory deprivation, of meaninglessness. Others find populated spaces most frightening, the fear of being hunted, of acute danger, of specific threats. The Backrooms mythology has tried to accommodate both by making some levels entity-rich and others nearly empty, but the balance continues to be debated. The entities also serve a narrative function. They provide conflict and stakes for stories. A tale of someone walking through empty yellow hallways for hours can be atmospherically effective, but might lack the dramatic tension that keeps readers engaged. Introducing an entity creates immediate danger, raises stakes, provides opportunities for action and escape sequences. From a storytelling perspective, entities make the Backrooms more viable as a setting for ongoing narratives, rather than just one-note horror vignettes. Psychologically, the entities represent externalization of anxiety. The backrooms themselves are about internal existential dread, but that can be abstract and hard to confront. Entities give that dread a face, a form, something concrete to run from or fight against. They transform the philosophical horror of meaninglessness into the visceral horror of physical threat. For some audiences, this makes the concept more accessible and emotionally impactful, even if it sacrifices some of the original's austere purity. The question of what the entities actually are remains deliberately vague in most interpretations. Are they native to the backrooms, evolved or created within this strange dimension? Are they transformed humans, victims who've become monsters? Are they manifestations of the backrooms itself, extruded from the architecture like antibodies fighting an infection? The lack of clear answers preserves mystery and allows different stories to explore different possibilities. Like the backrooms themselves, the entities are more effective when they remain partially unknown. By 2021 and 2022, the backrooms had transcended their origins as 4chan creepypasta to become a full-fledged cultural phenomenon. The concept appeared across virtually every platform and medium, from YouTube videos to video games to TikTok trends. But perhaps no single factor contributed more to the backrooms' mainstream breakthrough than the work of a teenage creator named Kane Parsons. Kane Parsons, working under the name Kane Pixels, released a short film titled The Backrooms Found Footage to YouTube in January 2022. The 9-minute video presented itself as recovered VHS footage of a cameraman who had accidentally fallen into the backrooms. Using sophisticated 3D rendering and video effects, Parsons created a remarkably convincing simulation of the yellow hallways, complete with the fluorescent lighting, the wet carpet, and the oppressive atmosphere of the original image. But he added something crucial: motion and sound. Seeing the backrooms in motion transformed the concept. The camera moves through the hallways with the jerky handheld quality of genuine found footage. The fluorescent lights buzz audibly. Footsteps echo on the damp carpet. The cameraman's breathing becomes ragged as panic sets in. The sense of scale, of endless hallways extending in every direction, becomes visceral in a way that still images couldn't quite capture. And then, in the video's most terrifying moment, something appears. Not clearly shown, just glimpsed at the edge of the frame. Something tall, something wrong, something that shouldn't be there. The video went massively viral, accumulating millions of views within weeks. It introduced the backrooms to audiences who had never encountered the concept before, and it set a new standard for what backrooms content could be. Parsons continued to release additional films expanding his version of the mythology, creating a narrative through line involving research organizations, government cover-ups, and increasingly dangerous entities. His work was professional quality, rivaling or exceeding the production values of many commercial horror properties, and he was doing it as a teenager working independently. Parsons' videos sparked an explosion of similar content. Other creators began producing their own backrooms films, using video game engines like Unity or Unreal Engine to create explorable simulations of different levels. Some focused on atmospheric horror, long, slow walks through empty spaces with subtle wrongness building over time. Others went for more action-oriented content, with entities actively hunting the cameraman and narrow escapes from danger. The variety ensured that there was backrooms content for every taste. The video game industry took notice as well. Multiple independent developers began creating backrooms games, many distributed for free on platforms like itch.io. These games ranged from simple walking simulators where the player wanders level 0 with no clear objective, to complex survival horror games with resource management, entity avoidance, and level progression. The open-source nature of the Backrooms mythology meant that developers could create games without worrying about licensing or copyright, and the built-in audience meant that even modest projects could find players. On TikTok, the Backrooms aesthetic merged with existing trends around liminal spaces and nostalgia. Users posted videos set to eerie music, showing real-world locations that had that Backrooms quality: empty malls, deserted schools, vacant office buildings. Some added effects to make the footage feel more unsettling: flickering lights, distorted audio, suggestions of movement in the background. The hashtag #JustBackrooms accumulated billions of views, introducing the concept to a young audience already primed by analog horror and aesthetic-focused content. Reddit communities dedicated to the Backrooms exploded in membership. Our Backrooms became a hub for sharing images, stories, and artwork. Our liminal space grew alongside it, focusing more broadly on the aesthetic of transitional spaces without the specific horror mythology. Users shared photographs from their own lives, places they'd been that had that off-transitional feeling. The phenomenon fed back into reality, with people becoming more aware of liminal qualities in their everyday environments and documenting them. Academic interest followed. Researchers in fields from psychology to architectural theory to media studies began writing about the Backrooms phenomenon. Papers explored why liminal spaces trigger unease, how collaborative storytelling functions in internet communities, what the Backrooms reveal about contemporary anxieties, and how digital folklore evolves differently from traditional folklore. The Backrooms became a case study in modern myth-making, an example of how stories develop and spread in the age of the internet. Art galleries and museums began incorporating Backrooms aesthetics into exhibitions about internet culture and digital art. Physical installations recreated the yellow hallways or other iconic levels, allowing visitors to step into the spaces they'd only seen in images and videos. These installations were often accompanied by ambient sound design, creating immersive environments that generated genuine unease despite visitors knowing they were safe. The transformation from internet ephemera to gallery-worthy art represented a legitimization of digital culture as worthy of serious artistic consideration. Fashion and design absorbed Backrooms aesthetics as well. The yellow and off-white colour palette appeared in clothing lines and interior design. The liminal space aesthetic influenced architecture, photography, and graphic design. What had started as creepy became, in some contexts, almost cool, a recognised aesthetic choice with specific connotations and emotional resonances. This is the life cycle of internet culture, emerging from niche communities, spreading to general awareness, and eventually being absorbed into broader cultural language. The mainstream media took notice too, though often with the condescension that traditional media brings to internet phenomena. Articles in major publications explained the Backrooms to confused older readers, often missing the nuances and treating it as merely the latest weird thing kids were into. But some coverage was more thoughtful, recognizing the Backrooms as a legitimate form of collaborative storytelling and exploring what its popularity suggested about contemporary fears and anxieties. The Backrooms also spawned imitators and related concepts. The pool rooms became popular enough to be considered a separate but related phenomenon. Dreamcore and weirdcore aesthetics emerged, sharing the liminal space interest but focusing more on surreal, impossible geometries and bright, saturated colours. The algorithm became a shorthand for the way internet recommendation systems could trap you in endless similar content, a digital version of the Backrooms' infinite hallways, the metaphor extended beyond the literal concept. Music producers created Backrooms-inspired ambient albums, long tracks of humming, buzzing, and distant echoing sounds meant to evoke the atmosphere of different levels. Some of this music was explicitly horror-themed, others positioned it as ambient music for sleep or focus, using the familiar but unsettling quality of the sounds to create a specific mood. The fact that people would willingly listen to simulated Backrooms ambience says something interesting about the appeal of controlled discomfort. Perhaps most surprisingly, the Backrooms found an audience among children and young teenagers. What would seem like nightmare fuel became, for many young people, a source of fascination and even comfort. Online communities filled with preteens discussing the mythology, creating their own levels, writing stories, and sharing images. For this audience, the Backrooms wasn't primarily horror. It was an imaginative playground, a collaborative world to explore and expand. The darkness was there, but it was darkness they controlled and could engage with on their own terms. This broad cultural penetration meant that by 2023, the Backrooms had achieved something rare for internet horror: genuine mainstream recognition. Most people, at least those under 40 or so, had some awareness of the concept, even if they couldn't explain the details. It had entered the cultural lexicon, becoming a reference point, a shared piece of digital folklore that transcended its origins. But with mainstream success came concerns. As the Backrooms reached younger and younger audiences, questions arose about psychological effects. Were children being traumatized by exposure to this horror content? Were people developing unhealthy obsessions? Was the line between fiction and reality becoming dangerously blurred? These concerns weren't entirely without merit, though the actual situation was more nuanced than simple moral panic. Reports emerged of children experiencing nightmares after viewing Backrooms content. Parents complained that their kids were afraid of everyday liminal spaces, hallways at school, empty areas of stores, anywhere that resembled Level 0. Some mental health professionals expressed concern that the Backrooms mythology might trigger or worsen anxiety disorders, particularly in individuals already prone to agoraphobia, claustrophobia, or dissociative states. The visceral nature of the horror, combined with its basis in real-world architectural spaces, created a situation where the fiction felt more immediately threatening than traditional horror monsters. Some individuals reported experiencing what they described as backroom syndrome, where they would look at ordinary liminal spaces and momentarily feel like they were actually in the backrooms, experiencing brief but intense anxiety or dissociation. This phenomenon, if we accept these self-reports as accurate, suggests that the imagery and mythology had become sufficiently embedded in these individuals' neural patterns that it could be involuntarily triggered by environmental cues. The brain, seeing similar spaces, activated the fear associations built through exposure to Backrooms content. There were also concerns about reality fiction boundaries. A small number of individuals appeared to genuinely believe the Backrooms were real, or at least reported believing this online. Whether they actually believed it, or were engaging in elaborate roleplay, was often unclear. Some posted guides for how to enter the Backrooms, or shared supposed techniques for no clipping out of reality. While most of this was clearly creative engagement with the mythology, the worry was that some vulnerable individuals might take it seriously and potentially harm themselves trying to enter a fictional dimension. The phenomenon of kids these days are too scared of the horror content is as old as horror itself. Every generation has its moral panic about scary stories corrupting youth, but there might be something unique about the Backrooms, Unlike a horror movie that you watch and then leave behind, or a book you close, the backrooms are embedded in real-world spaces. You can't escape reminders because liminal spaces are everywhere. Every hallway, every basement, every empty room can trigger the association. This ambient quality means the horror isn't contained to specific media experiences, but potentially bleeds into everyday life. However, it's important not to overstate the danger. For the vast majority of people, including children and teenagers, engaging with Backrooms content was harmless entertainment. Many found it fascinating or fun rather than genuinely frightening. The collaborative nature of the mythology gave people agency. They weren't passive consumers of scares, but active participants in creating and expanding a fictional world. This active engagement is typically psychologically healthier than passive consumption of horror content. Moreover, there's value in confronting fear in controlled contexts. Horror has always served a psychological function, allowing us to experience danger, process fear, and master anxiety in situations where we're actually safe. The Backrooms, by basing its horror in mundane spaces, might actually help people become more comfortable with uncomfortable feelings, learning that liminal spaces, while vaguely unsettling, aren't actually dangerous. Exposure to controlled fear can build resilience. The community itself generally took concerns about mental health seriously. The Backrooms subreddit and Discord servers often included warnings about potentially distressing content and resources for mental health support. Contributors tried to mark particularly intense content appropriately. When very young children were found participating in discussions, older community members typically encouraged them to wait until they were older, or directed them toward less intense content. This self-regulation wasn't perfect, but it demonstrated awareness of the responsibility that comes with creating and sharing horror content. There was also discussion about the ethics of collaborative horror in general. When a mythology has no single author, who's responsible for ensuring it doesn't cross ethical lines? If someone writes a particularly disturbing story, or creates an especially frightening character, and someone else is traumatized by it, where does the responsibility lie? These questions don't have easy answers. The democratic, decentralized nature of projects like the Backrooms is part of what makes them creative and compelling, but it also means there's no editorial oversight, no one enforcing content standards or considering psychological impacts. Some argued that the Backrooms needed content warnings or age restrictions. Others felt this would be impractical and contrary to the spirit of open, collaborative creation. The debate reflected broader tensions about content moderation on the internet, balancing freedom of expression with protection of vulnerable users. These tensions remain unresolved, and different platforms hosting Backrooms content have taken different approaches. It's also worth considering what the Backrooms' popularity among young people says about their psychological landscape. If millions of children and teenagers are drawn to horror based on empty transitional spaces, what does that suggest about their experience of the world? Perhaps it reflects anxiety about the future, about being in a perpetual state of transition without clear destination. Perhaps it reflects feeling lost in systems, educational, social, economic, that seem too large and complex to navigate. Perhaps it's simply that each generation finds its own horror vocabulary, and for this generation, it's endless yellow hallways. The phenomenon also highlighted how internet culture can create feedback loops between fiction and reality. The more popular the Backrooms became, the more people looked for Backrooms-like spaces in reality and photographed them. This created more content that looked like the Backrooms, which reinforced the mythology, which made more people look for similar spaces. The fiction and reality informed each other in ways that made the boundaries less clear. This isn't unique to the Backrooms, but it's a particularly clear example of how digital culture can blur the line between the real and the imagined. To truly understand the Backrooms phenomenon, we need to look beyond the specific mythology and examine what it reveals about contemporary anxieties, about how we relate to space and place, and about what frightens us in the early 21st century. The Backrooms aren't just a scary story. They're a mirror reflecting our deepest unease about the world we've built. Let's start with architecture. The spaces depicted in the Backrooms, commercial carpeting, drop ceilings, fluorescent lights, industrial corridors, are the infrastructure of modern capitalism. These are spaces designed for efficiency and economy, not comfort or beauty. They're the Backrooms, literally the hidden spaces that allow the front stage areas, the shopping areas, the office spaces to function. We're not supposed to see them or think about them, but they're everywhere, supporting the surfaces we do see. The horror of the Backrooms is partly the horror of seeing the machinery laid bare. It's like glimpsing backstage during a play. It breaks the illusion. These utilitarian spaces remind us that the comfortable, designed environments we inhabit are just facades over infrastructure that's often ugly, cheap, and purely functional. The Backrooms take that infrastructure and make it the entire world, stripping away the facade entirely. You're stuck in the machinery, in the systems, with no escape to the comfortable surfaces. This resonates in an era where many people feel trapped in systems they don't control or fully understand. The bureaucracy of modern life, dealing with insurance companies, government agencies, corporate customer service, can feel like wandering endless, identical corridors trying to find someone who can help. The Backrooms literalize this feeling. You're navigating a system that seems designed to frustrate navigation, where every turn looks the same, where there's no clear way forward or back, where you suspect there's no one in charge who could help, even if you found them. The endlessness of the Backrooms speaks to anxieties about scale. Modern life involves systems that are too large for individual comprehension. Supply chains spanning the globe, financial systems so complex that experts don't fully understand them, information networks generating more data every day than any human could process in a lifetime. We live in a world of incomprehensible scale, and that scale is abstractly frightening. The Backrooms make this abstract fear concrete, giving us a space that's literally too large to comprehend or navigate. The obsolescence embedded in Level Zero's aesthetic is also telling. The yellow wallpaper, the 1980s or 1990s fluorescent lights, the dated carpet, all suggest a space frozen in time, a past that won't let go. This speaks to anxieties about stagnation, about feeling stuck in outdated systems and structures. The architecture of our cities and institutions often is from decades ago, built for different economies and demographics. We inherit spaces designed for worlds that no longer exist, and we can't easily reshape them. The Backrooms take this feeling of being trapped in inherited, obsolete structures and make it total. The emptiness is crucial too. Where are the people? In a world increasingly characterized by alienation and atomization, despite or because of constant digital connection, the Backrooms present ultimate isolation. You're in spaces designed for crowds, for activity, for function, but you're completely alone. This resonates with feelings of loneliness in crowded cities, of being surrounded by people but disconnected from them, of moving through life in parallel to others without real contact. The Backrooms externalize the internal sense of isolation many people feel. The maintenance failure, the damp carpet, the flickering lights, the peeling wallpaper suggests systemic decay. infrastructure crumbling, systems breaking down, no one maintaining things anymore. This taps into anxieties about institutions failing, about the social contract fraying, about everything slowly falling apart while no one with authority seems capable of or interested in fixing it. The Backrooms show a world that's still functioning. The lights are still on, but it's clearly in decline, clearly failing, and there's no help coming. The no-clipping concept, the idea of falling through reality into the Backrooms, speaks to anxieties about fragility and accident. You're just living your life, walking down a hallway, and suddenly you slip through and everything normal is gone forever. This captures the fear of how quickly life can change, how one moment, one accident, one wrong step can alter everything irreversibly. It's the anxiety of knowing that safety and normality are thinner and more fragile than we like to believe. The inability to escape, the impossibility of finding your way back to reality, connects to feelings of being trapped in circumstances beyond your control, economic systems that seem designed to keep you barely afloat, career paths that lead nowhere, relationships or situations you can't escape, life choices that seemed fine at the time but turned out to be traps. The Backrooms make this feeling of being trapped literal and absolute. There's no exit. The system you're in is all there is. The surveillance aspect, the sense of being watched in empty spaces, the entities that have heard you, reflects anxieties about privacy and observation. We live in an era of unprecedented surveillance, cameras, data collection, algorithmic monitoring. We're observed constantly by systems and entities we can't see. The Backrooms capture this feeling. You're in empty spaces, but you're not alone. Something is watching. Something has tracked you. Your presence has been noted and you can't hide. It's the paranoia of total surveillance made visceral. The sameness, the endless, identical rooms and hallways speaks to the monotony and meaninglessness that many people experience in modern life. Work that feels pointless, days that blur together, environments designed for generic use rather than specific human needs. The Backrooms take this sameness to an extreme, creating a world where literally everything is identical, where there's no variation, no purpose, no meaning. It's the fear that your life is just repetition without progress, difference without distinction, time passing without anything actually mattering. The community and survival aspects that emerged in the mythology, the MEG, the bases on safer levels, the mutual aid, reflect a desire for solidarity and cooperation in hostile environments. Even in the nightmare, people find each other and try to help each other survive. This speaks to a recognition that collective action and mutual support are necessary responses to overwhelming systemic threats. The Backrooms become not just horror, but also a space for imagining resistance and community in the face of impossible circumstances. The specific architecture matters too. Office buildings, malls, hotels, these are the spaces of capitalism, of consumption and production. They're spaces that exist primarily to facilitate economic activity, not human flourishing. The Backrooms strip away the economic activity but leave the spaces, revealing their fundamental hostility to actual human life. You can't live in an office building or a mall. These are transitional spaces, not homes. Being trapped in them reveals their true nature as spaces designed for extraction and efficiency, not for habitation or comfort. The yellow colour specifically carries meaning. Yellow is a colour of caution, of warning. It's the colour of hazmat suits and quarantine tape. It's also associated with illness, with jaundice, with decay. The sickly yellow of the Backrooms suggests contamination, suggests something wrong, suggests danger that's present but not immediately obvious. It's the colour of slow poisoning, of environmental toxins, of being in a place that's quietly harmful. In an era of environmental crisis, of microplastics and forever chemicals, of invisible contamination everywhere, the yellow of the backrooms resonates. The fluorescent lighting is also symbolically loaded, artificial light that banishes natural darkness, that creates a perpetual false day. This is how we live now, under artificial lights that disrupt circadian rhythms, in climate-controlled spaces that disconnect us from natural cycles. The backrooms take this artificial environment to its extreme, creating a space where natural light never penetrates, where it's always the same false day under buzzing artificial suns. It's the logical endpoint of our separation from nature, being entirely enclosed in artificial systems. The moisture, the damp carpet, the suggestion of water damage implies that the systems are failing. Water is infiltrating. Barriers are breaking down. The distinction between inside and outside is degrading. This can be read as anxiety about climate change, about rising waters, about environmental boundaries that we thought were secure turning out to be permeable. The backrooms are rotting from within, just as our climate systems are degrading from human impact. The mythology around entities and dangers can be read psychologically rather than literally. The things that hunt you in the backrooms could represent internal threats, anxiety, depression, trauma, mental illness. The safe zones and dangerous zones could represent different mental states. The levels could represent layers of consciousness or severity of psychological crisis. In this reading, the backrooms become a map of psychological suffering, a way of literalizing and exploring mental health struggles through spatial metaphor. The impossibility of mapping or understanding the space reflects epistemic anxiety, uncertainty about whether we can understand the world we live in. Science and reason promised we'd comprehend everything, but the world keeps revealing itself to be more complex, more chaotic, more resistant to simple understanding than we hoped. The backrooms, which can't be mapped or understood despite being navigable, capture this feeling that we're moving through systems that exceed our capacity for comprehension. The collaborative nature of the mythology itself is meaningful. This isn't one person's nightmare, it's a collective nightmare, built by thousands of contributors. This suggests that the anxieties the backrooms express are not individual but social, shared across a generation or a culture. The fact that so many people immediately understood and connected to the concept indicates that it articulates something many people feel but couldn't express. The backrooms gave form to formless dread. The virality of the concept, the speed with which it spread, suggests that it arrived at the right moment. May 2019, pre-pandemic, but in a time of rising social and political anxiety. The world felt unstable. Traditional structures seemed to be failing. The future felt uncertain. And then, a few months later, the pandemic hit, and suddenly everyone was trapped in their homes, unable to navigate freely, surrounded by invisible threat, living in a kind of real-world backrooms. The timing gave the mythology additional resonance. The pandemic period saw massive increases in interest in the backrooms. This makes psychological sense. People were trapped at home, familiar spaces becoming unfamiliar through extended forced occupation. The outside world became dangerous and off-limits. Time became weird and compressed, days blurring together. The feeling of being in a liminal state, waiting for normal life to resume, became universal. The backrooms captured this feeling perfectly, and engaging with the mythology might have been a way of processing pandemic experience. Post-pandemic, the backrooms continue to resonate, perhaps because we haven't truly exited the liminal state. The world didn't return to normal, it changed. We're living in an in-between time. After the old normal but without a clear new normal, economic precarity, political instability, climate crisis, rapid technological change all contribute to a sense of being in transition without destination. The Backrooms externalize this feeling, giving us a space that's all transition, all liminality, with no arrival. The generational aspect is also important. The Backrooms are particularly popular with millennials and Gen Z, generations that came of age during economic crisis that face unprecedented challenges regarding housing, employment, climate, and social stability. These are generations that were promised one kind of future and received another. The Backrooms, with their obsolete 1980s and 1990s aesthetic, could represent the failed promises of that era. These spaces of prosperity and normalcy that previous generations built and these generations inherited in decayed form. The nostalgia embedded in the Backrooms aesthetic is complicated. It's not warm nostalgia for a better time. It's nostalgia for a time that seemed more stable, more comprehensible, but that also contained the seeds of current problems. The yellow hallways are from the past, but they're not comforting. They're familiar but threatening. This captures the complicated relationship many young people have with previous decades, recognizing that those times created the problems we now face while also yearning for their apparent simplicity and stability. The fact that the Backrooms are endless matters existentially. In a universe that might be infinite, on a planet with finite resources, facing problems that seem impossible to solve. The endlessness of the Backrooms captures both cosmic horror and ecological anxiety. You can walk forever and never escape. The resources will run out. The monotony will continue. There's no exit. This is genuinely frightening in a way that monster horror isn't, because it's closer to certain real fears about the human situation. The hierarchy of levels, with some safer than others, some more dangerous, suggests that even in horror there's structure, there are gradations. Level 0 is terrible but survivable. Level 5 is instant death. This maps onto how we actually experience threat in reality. Not everything is maximally dangerous all the time. There are degrees of risk, spaces of relative safety within generally hostile environments. The Backrooms mythology acknowledges this, creating a more nuanced horror that reflects the complexity of real anxiety. The knowledge systems that developed around the Backrooms, the wikis, the survival guides, the entity classifications, represent an attempt to impose order on chaos. This is what humans do. We create taxonomies, maps, systems of understanding. The Backrooms resist this, constantly expanding beyond any complete catalogue, but we keep trying anyway. This reflects the human drive to understand and control through knowledge, even when the thing we're trying to understand is vast, hostile, and possibly incomprehensible. The act of cataloguing the Backrooms is itself a form of resistance against the horror they represent. The emphasis on survival strategies, rather than escape, is telling. The mythology largely accepts that once you're in the Backrooms, you're not getting out. The goal isn't escape, but survival, finding safe zones, gathering resources, avoiding dangers. This might reflect a broader shift from optimism about solving problems to acceptance that we're living with ongoing crises. Climate change won't be solved, just managed. Economic precarity won't end, just survived. The Backrooms mythology acknowledges this, focusing on endurance rather than victory. The community elements, the MEG and other survivor groups, suggest that collective action is the only meaningful response to impossible individual circumstances. You can't escape the Backrooms alone, but you might survive them with others. This is politically resonant, suggesting that individual solutions to systemic problems are impossible, but collective organization might make the unbearable bearable. The Backrooms become a space for imagining mutual aid and solidarity in the face of overwhelming hostile systems. The digital nature of the phenomenon is also significant. The Backrooms exist primarily online, as texts, images, videos, games. They're digital folklore, native to the internet. This makes them slippery, hard to pin down, constantly evolving. There's no definitive version, no canonical text. This mirrors how we experience reality increasingly through digital mediation, where truth is contested, where multiple versions of events coexist, where the real and the simulated blur. The Backrooms are horror for the digital age, horror that exists in the same space as our social lives, our politics, our reality. The aesthetics of the Backrooms, the low-resolution images, the VHS-style videos, the analog horror presentation, represent a longing for a pre-digital or early digital era. This is ironic given that the phenomenon is thoroughly digital and couldn't exist without the internet. But the aesthetic harks back to a time before digital saturation, before social media, before smartphones. It's nostalgia for analog reality, expressed through digital means. This contradiction is itself interesting, suggesting ambivalence about the digital world even while participating fully in it. The way the Backrooms turned architecture into antagonist is particularly contemporary. In horror traditionally, the threat comes from the natural world, monsters from the wilderness, or from perversions of human nature, serial killers and vampires. The Backrooms make the threat the built environment itself. Not a monster lurking in the building, but the building as monster. This reflects anxiety about the spaces we've created, the systems we've built turning hostile to their creators. The architecture meant to shelter and facilitate human life becomes a trap. The Backrooms also represent a kind of anti-capitalism horror. These are spaces of capital, commercial and institutional architecture, stripped of their economic function. Without commerce to justify them, they become nightmarish. This suggests that these spaces have no value beyond their economic utility, that they're hostile to human needs when divorced from profit motives. The shopping malls, office buildings and hotels of the Backrooms are revealed as fundamentally inhuman once the commercial activity ceases. They were never for us. They were for capital, and without capital's animating presence they become tombs. From a computer science perspective, which is relevant for the Sleepy Computer Scientist channel, the Backrooms can be read as a glitch in reality's programming. The no-clipping concept comes directly from video game glitches, where you pass through solid geometry due to programming errors. The Backrooms suggest that reality itself might have similar flaws, places where the rules break down, where you can fall through into the spaces between. This treats physical reality like a simulation with bugs, which resonates in an era where simulation hypothesis and virtual reality are serious topics of discussion. The procedural generation quality of the Backrooms, endless variations on a theme, mirrors how video game environments are created algorithmically. The rooms and hallways could be generated by a simple algorithm, creating infinite variety from limited rules. This connects the Backrooms to concerns about algorithmic systems, recommendation algorithms, search algorithms, systems that generate endless content that all feels subtly the same. The Backrooms are like an algorithmic hell, infinite output from a simple, soulless process. The loss of agency is crucial. In the Backrooms, you can't choose to leave. You can move through the space, make tactical decisions, but you can't make the strategic choice to exit the system entirely. This mirrors how many people feel about systems in real life. You can make small choices within capitalism, within political systems, within social structures, but you can't choose to opt out entirely. The Backrooms literalize this lack of systemic agency, creating a space where the only choice is how to navigate, not whether to participate. The monotony and meaninglessness connect to discussions of alienation and purpose. If you're in the Backrooms, what's the point? There's no goal, no achievement, no progress except survival. This existential emptiness reflects anxieties about modern life lacking meaning, about going through motions without purpose, about systems that sustain themselves without serving human needs or values. The Backrooms ask, what if you survived forever in spaces that have no meaning beyond bare existence? Would that be life or just extended dying? The Backrooms ultimately work as horror because they take feelings many people have. Feelings of being lost, trapped, alone, watched, surrounded by hostile systems, living in obsolete structures, lacking agency or escape, and make them concrete and total. They're the externalization of internal states, anxiety made architectural. And because these internal states are so common in contemporary life, the Backrooms resonate widely. They're not a fantasy horror detached from reality. They're a horror that feels dangerously close to real experience, just intensified and made literal. As we come to the end of our journey through the yellow hallways, it's worth reflecting on what we've discovered. The Backrooms began as a single photograph and a short piece of creative writing on an anonymous image board. Within months, it had grown into one of the internet's most extensive collaborative mythologies. Within years, it has become a cultural touchstone, influencing everything from video games to academic research to architectural photography. The power of the Backrooms lies in their simplicity and their openness. The original concept was vague enough to allow interpretation, but specific enough to create a strong aesthetic and emotional foundation. The collaborative nature meant that thousands of people could contribute, each adding their own fears and visions to the collective nightmare. The result is a mythology that's remarkably rich and varied, accommodating everything from existential dread to creature-feature horror to survival adventure to psychological thriller. But beyond the creative success, the Backrooms reveal something important about contemporary anxieties. They show us what a generation finds frightening, not monsters or gore, but empty spaces and endless systems. Not acute danger, but chronic unease. Not the spectacular, but the mundane taken to an extreme. The Backrooms are horror for an age of bureaucracy, alienation, and systemic complexity. They give form to formless dread, making the abstract threats of modern life concrete and navigable, if not escapable. The phenomenon also demonstrates the power of internet communities to create culture. Without gatekeepers, publishers, or traditional media infrastructure, a community built a world as complex and detailed as many commercial fictional universes. The democratic, distributed nature of this creation meant it could evolve rapidly, incorporate diverse perspectives, and respond quickly to what resonated with audiences. This is cultural production for the digital age, fast, collaborative, and uncontrolled by any central authority. The real-world impact of the Backrooms, from Kane Parsons' films to the indie games to the academic papers, shows that internet folklore can have genuine cultural significance. What starts as niche internet content can spread widely and influence multiple domains. The boundary between internet culture and mainstream culture continues to blur, and the Backrooms are a clear example of how internet-native concepts can achieve broader relevance. The investigation into the photograph's origins, the discovery that it came from a hobby store in Wisconsin, adds an interesting coda to the story. The mundane reality grounds the mythology, reminding us that horror often begins with the ordinary. The gap between the actual location and what it became in the collective imagination demonstrates the power of storytelling and interpretation. A simple documentation photograph became a portal to an infinite nightmare dimension, not because of anything inherent in the image itself, but because of what people saw in it and built upon it. The concerns about mental health effects and reality fiction boundaries remind us that powerful ideas have consequences. Horror that's effective is horror that affects people, and the Backrooms are undeniably effective for many. The responsibility for managing these effects is distributed across creators, platforms, communities, and individuals, without clear answers about how to balance creative freedom with psychological safety. This is an ongoing challenge for internet culture generally, not just for the Backrooms specifically. Looking forward, the Backrooms will likely continue to evolve. New levels will be created, new entities imagined, new stories told. The mythology is robust enough to accommodate ongoing expansion while maintaining its core identity. Whether it will have the staying power of older internet folklore like Slender Man or SCP remains to be seen, but it has already achieved enough cultural penetration to likely persist in some form for years to come. The Backrooms may also influence horror more broadly. The emphasis on environmental horror, on liminal spaces, on the mundane made menacing, could shape how horror creators approach atmosphere and setting. The collaborative world-building model could inspire similar projects. The aesthetic may continue to influence photography, design, and architecture. Cultural phenomena of this scale don't vanish completely. They leave traces that influence what comes after. For those who've never encountered the Backrooms before tonight, I hope this exploration has been illuminating, showing how a simple image can spawn a complex mythology that reveals deep truths about contemporary anxiety. For those already familiar with the yellow hallways, I hope this has provided new perspectives on why the Backrooms work so effectively as horror, and what they say about our cultural moment. In the end, the Backrooms are a mirror. They reflect our fears about spaces, systems, isolation, meaninglessness, and entrapment. They show us what we find unsettling about the world we've built. Empty corridors that go nowhere, artificial lights that never turn off, damp carpet that squelches under your feet, the hum of machinery with no purpose, the sense of being watched by something unseen. These are elements from our real environments, just intensified and made absolute. The Backrooms work as horror because they're not entirely fictional. We recognize them. We've been there, in smaller doses, in brief moments, and some part of us fears we might end up there permanently. The photograph that started it all remains striking. Look at it now, knowing its origin, knowing what it became, and it still creates that flutter of unease. The yellow walls, the fluorescent lights, the empty hallways extending beyond the frame. Something about it simply feels wrong, feels threatening, feels like a place you shouldn't be. That instinctive reaction, that aesthetic sensitivity to spaces that are off, is what the Backrooms tap into. It's a real phenomenon, a genuine aspect of human psychology, and the mythology built upon it has created one of the most effective collaborative horror projects in internet history. We don't know what the future holds for the Backrooms. Will they fade as internet trends do, replaced by the next viral horror concept? Or will they endure, becoming a permanent fixture of digital folklore? Will they continue to evolve and expand, or will they crystallize into a fixed mythology? These questions remain unanswered, suspended in the liminal space between past and future, much like the backrooms themselves exist in the space between reality and unreality. What we do know is that the backrooms have already succeeded in their primary function. They've scared us. They've made us think twice about walking down empty hallways. They've made us notice the liminal spaces in our lives. They've given us a vocabulary for discussing a particular flavour of unease. They've created a shared cultural reference point that millions of people recognise, and they've demonstrated once again that the most effective horror often comes not from elaborate monsters or gory violence, but from taking the familiar and making it strange, from showing us that the spaces we move through every day might not be as safe or as comprehensible as we assume. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the infinite yellow hallways. If you've enjoyed this exploration of how one photograph created an endless maze of terror, I invite you to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments. The sleepy computer scientist will continue exploring the strange intersections of technology, culture, and human psychology. There are endless rabbit holes to descend, endless mysteries to unravel, and endless stories to tell. But for now, as you lie here in the darkness, think about the spaces you pass through every day. The hallways, the corridors, the empty rooms, the transitional zones you barely notice. What if you no-clipped? What if you fell through? What if one day you turned a corner and found yourself in a place that looks familiar but isn't quite right? What if the hallways went on forever? What if you could never find your way back? These are the questions the backrooms ask, and they don't offer comfortable answers. They remind us that reality is thinner than we like to believe, that the spaces we inhabit are stranger than they seem, and that the line between the normal and the nightmare is closer than we realize. They tell us that the maze is real, it's around us, we're already in it. We just haven't noticed yet. Or maybe we have noticed, and that's why the backrooms resonate so deeply. They articulate something we already knew but couldn't express. The feeling that we're lost, that we're trapped, that the hallways go on forever, that we're trying to find our way home but the path keeps shifting, that we're alone in spaces designed for crowds, that something is watching from the shadows. The backrooms are a story we told ourselves about ourselves, a collaborative nightmare that reveals our collective fears, a maze we built together from photographs, words, and shared dread. And like all the best horror, they're effective because they're true. Not literally, perhaps, but emotionally, psychologically, metaphorically. We are lost in systems we don't understand. We are trapped in structures we can't escape. We are isolated despite being surrounded by others. We are navigating spaces that seem to extend forever without clear destination. We are, in some sense, already in the backrooms. The mythology just makes it visible. So as you drift off to sleep tonight, as your consciousness loosens and the boundary between waking and dreaming softens, remember that the backrooms exist in that liminal space too. They're not quite real and not quite fictional. They're something in between, like the spaces they describe. And maybe that's the most unsettling thing of all. Not that the backrooms might be real, but that they might be more real than we want to admit. That the yellow hallways might be metaphor made literal, anxiety given form, the feeling of modern life crystallized into architecture. But you're safe here, for now. You're not in the backrooms. You're in your bed, in your room, in the world you know. The hallways only go as far as they really go. The lights will turn off when you want them to. The spaces have boundaries, purposes, meanings. You can find your way home because you're already there. The nightmare is just a story, just images and words, just a collaborative fiction built by strangers on the internet. Unless, of course, you hear something in the hallway outside your room, footsteps that aren't yours, movement in spaces that should be empty, the hum of lights that shouldn't be on, a smell like old carpet, damp and musty, the sense of watching eyes from shadows that shouldn't exist. But that's probably nothing, just your imagination stirred by stories, just the house settling, the pipes groaning, the wind against windows, just the normal sounds of normal spaces in normal reality. Probably. If you're still awake, you can watch the next video when you're ready. But if your eyes are growing heavy, if sleep is calling, if the boundary between waking and dreaming is beginning to blur, then let yourself drift. Let the stories fade. Let the yellow hallways recede back into imagination. Let the humming lights grow quiet. Let the endless maze dissolve into the darkness behind your eyelids. Close your eyes. Breathe slowly. Feel the weight of your body on your bed. Feel the real solid world holding you. Feel the safety of known spaces, of boundaries, of home. The backrooms can't reach you here. They're just a story, just pixels on screens, just words in the dark, just a feeling you sometimes get walking down empty hallways. Just a sense that something is wrong with spaces you can't quite name. Just a fear that maybe someday you'll turn a corner and the hallway will extend forever. But not tonight. Tonight you're safe. Tonight you're home. Tonight you can rest. The backrooms will wait, patient and infinite in the spaces between. They'll always be there, should you ever know clip out of reality. But for now, you're here, and here is solid, here is real, here is safe. Sleep well, wanderer. Dream of yellow walls if you must. But remember, when you wake, you'll find your way back to the world you know. The doors will open, the hallways will end, the lights will go off, and the back rooms will remain what they've always been. A story we told in the dark about spaces that frighten us and systems that trap us. A collaborative nightmare that helps us name our fears so we can live with them. As your breathing slows and deepens, as the day's thoughts begin to scatter and dissolve, let the story of the back rooms fade with them. It's been a long journey through yellow hallways and empty rooms, through the history of how one photograph became a mythology, through the psychology of why liminal spaces unsettle us so deeply. We've walked through the levels, encountered the entities, traced the investigation that found the real location, and explored what this phenomenon reveals about our contemporary anxieties. The backrooms will still be there tomorrow, infinite and waiting, preserved in images and wikis and videos across the internet. But tonight, you don't need to wander them. Tonight, you're safe in familiar spaces, surrounded by walls that have boundaries, in rooms that have purposes, under lights that turn off when you want them to. The hallways outside your door lead somewhere. The spaces around you are navigable, comprehensible, finite. The story is fascinating, isn't it? How a simple photograph could spawn such an elaborate mythology. How thousands of people could collaborate to build a world of horror without any central authority or plan. How something so simple, empty rooms, yellow wallpaper, fluorescent lights, could tap into such profound unease. It speaks to the power of the internet as a space for collective creativity, for shared storytelling, for giving form to feelings that individuals struggle to articulate alone. But it also speaks to something deeper about the human condition. Our need to make sense of our fears, our drive to name what troubles us, our impulse to create stories that help us process the anxieties of our age. The backrooms aren't just entertainment. They're a coping mechanism, a way of taking formless modern dread and giving it shape, giving it rules, making it something that can be discussed and explored and even, in some strange way, mastered. When you create a wiki entry about a fictional level, when you write survival tips for navigating imaginary spaces, when you classify entities that don't exist, you're doing something profoundly human. You're imposing order on chaos. You're creating the illusion of control in a world that often feels uncontrollable. The Backrooms mythology is, in this sense, an act of defiance. The universe throws incomprehensible vastness at us, and we respond by cataloguing it, by breaking it into levels and entities and rules. There's something beautiful in that, something hopeful, even in a horror context. It suggests that even in the face of infinite emptiness, even trapped in systems we don't understand, even lost in spaces that all look the same, humans will still try to map, to understand, to survive together. The Miji in the Backrooms lore, the major explorer group, represents this impulse perfectly. Even in the nightmare, we form communities. We share knowledge. We help each other endure. This has been the Sleepy Computer Scientist, exploring the intersection of technology, culture, and human psychology. The Backrooms are a perfect example of how these domains intersect. A digital photograph, circulated through internet infrastructure, interpreted through the lens of contemporary anxieties, transformed through collaborative creativity into a phenomenon that tells us something true about who we are and what we fear. If you found this journey illuminating, if it helped you understand why those empty hallways feel so unsettling, or if it simply gave you something interesting to contemplate as you drift towards sleep, I invite you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What aspects of the Backrooms resonate most with you? Have you experienced that liminal space feeling in your own life? Do you see the Backrooms as primarily horror, or as something more complex? The Sleepy Computer Scientist will continue exploring these digital phenomena, these strange stories born from the internet that reveal deeper truths about our world. There are countless mysteries left to examine, endless rabbit holes to descend, infinite hallways of knowledge to wander. But unlike the Backrooms, these explorations have destinations. They lead somewhere. They end with understanding, or at least with better questions than we started with. For now, though, let yourself rest. You've learned the origin story, understood the psychology, explored the levels, met the entities, and discovered what the Backrooms reveal about contemporary life. You've walked the yellow hallways in your mind, and now you can leave them behind. The investigation is complete. The analysis is finished. The story, for tonight at least, has reached its end. Your own room, your own bed, your own safe space is so much better than the Backrooms could ever be. It's not infinite, which means you can't get lost. It's not empty. It contains you and perhaps others you love. It's not liminal. It's not a space you pass through. It's a destination, a place to be, not a place to escape from. The lights can turn off, which means darkness can bring true rest, not just deeper horror. Feel the weight of your blankets. Feel the support of your mattress. Feel the solid walls that define your space and keep it separate from the endless corridors of the Backrooms mythology. This is real. This is home. This is safe. The yellow hallways are just pixels and words, just a shared story, just a fascinating example of how human creativity and anxiety intertwine in the digital age. As you close your eyes, you don't need to see yellow walls. You can see darkness, welcoming and complete. As your breathing steadies, you don't need to hear the hum of fluorescent lights. You can hear silence or gentle ambient sounds, or your own heartbeat marking time in a rhythm that's finite and familiar. As you sink deeper into rest, you don't need to walk endless identical hallways. You can simply be still, anchored, present in the here and now. The Backrooms are a powerful idea, but they're just that, an idea. They can't hurt you. They can't trap you. They exist only in the collective imagination of the internet, sustained by stories and images, but ultimately as insubstantial as any fiction. When you wake tomorrow, the world will still be complex and sometimes frightening, but it will be navigable. It will make sense, or at least enough sense to move through it. And if you ever do feel lost, if the spaces around you start to feel too empty or too repetitive, if the systems you navigate begin to feel like mazes, remember that you're not alone. Others feel this way too. That's why the Backrooms resonated so powerfully. That's why thousands contributed to the mythology. We're all trying to make sense of spaces that feel wrong, systems that seem designed to confuse us, experiences that leave us feeling isolated despite being surrounded by others. But unlike the Backrooms, the real world has exits, has communities, has support, has meaning we create ourselves. The hallways do end, the doors do open, the lights do turn off, and home is always findable, even when the journey there feels difficult. So rest now. Let the Backrooms fade into the background of memory, joining all the other interesting ideas you've encountered, but don't need to carry with you into sleep. Let the investigation dissolve. Let the yellow walls recede. Let the entities retreat back into imagination. Let the levels collapse into simpler dreams or into the gentle void of deep, restorative sleep. The sleepy computer scientist will be here if you want to explore more mysteries another night. But for now, your exploration is complete. You've understood the Backrooms, you've traced their origin, mapped their growth, analysed their meaning. That's enough. That's more than enough. Now you can rest, satisfied with knowledge, comfortable in understanding, safe in the real world that, despite all its flaws and fears, is infinitely better than any infinite maze could ever be. Good night, wanderer. May your dreams be finite. May your rest be deep. May you wake refreshed, oriented, and certain of where you are. The Backrooms were just a story. This, here and now, is real, and real is where you belong. Sweet dreams.